Picture an ancient city, thousands of years before soap, before running water, before anyone understood what a germ was. And yet the people living there were rubbing scented oils onto their skin, burning fragrant resins in their temples, and trading specific aromatic ingredients across enormous distances at real cost and real risk. That should strike you as backwards. Cleanliness, you'd assume, comes first. And pleasant smells come later, as a finishing touch. But the archaeological and historical record tells a very different story. And it's stranger and more revealing than you'd expect. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why perfume came before soap, what ancient people were actually trying to accomplish by covering themselves in scent, and why that instinct turns out to be far older and far more functional than anyone assumes when they picture perfume as pure vanity. Let's start with the timeline itself, because it's the detail that makes this whole story worth investigating. Archaeological evidence for perfume-like practices, burning aromatic resins, applying scented oils to the body, using fragrant plants in ritual contexts, stretches back at least 4,000 years in ancient Mesopotamia, with some evidence suggesting related practices go back even further. Soap, by contrast, in anything resembling its modern chemical form, doesn't show up clearly in the historical record until roughly the same broad era at the earliest, and widespread personal use of soap for regular bathing didn't become common in most of the ancient world for a very long time after that. For long stretches of early human history, people were perfuming themselves regularly while having no reliable method of what we'd now call actually washing. Think about how strange that ordering actually is. If perfume were simply a way to smell nice after getting clean, you'd expect cleaning technology to come first, logically, functionally. Instead, the evidence suggests ancient people were reaching for fragrance as a tool long before they had reliable tools for removing dirt and odor at the source. That single fact should make you suspicious of the assumption that perfume was ever primarily about vanity or luxury. Something else was clearly going on. So what were ancient people actually trying to accomplish? The most direct answer, according to historians studying early perfume use, is that fragrance in the ancient world was rarely just about personal appeal, the way we think of cologne or perfume today. It was deeply tied to religion, medicine, and social status, often all three simultaneously, and personal hygiene as we understand it, barely factored in at all. In ancient Egypt, one of the most extensively documented early perfume cultures, fragrant oils and resins were used constantly in temple rituals, believed to please the gods and to serve as a literal, physical connection between the human and the divine. Egyptian priests burned incense as part of daily temple offerings, and the word itself in some ancient Egyptian contexts is thought to have carried a meaning close to fragrance of the gods. This wasn't personal grooming. It was religious infrastructure, considered essential to maintaining the proper relationship between human society and the divine order that ancient Egyptians believed governed the world. Here's where it gets more interesting. Because refrigeration didn't exist, because open sewers and unwashed streets were an unavoidable daily reality in most ancient cities, and because bodies decomposing after death were an ordinary, visible part of ancient urban life, strong, unpleasant odors were simply a constant, unavoidable feature of the ancient world in a way that's almost impossible for a modern person to fully imagine. Fragrant oils, burned resins, and scented ointments weren't primarily about enhancing an already pleasant scent. They were functioning as a practical response to a world that smelled, by any modern standard, genuinely difficult to tolerate for extended periods. This helps explain something that seems strange from a modern viewpoint. Many ancient perfumes weren't light, subtle, or what we'd today call clean-smelling at all. They were often intensely strong, heavy, resinous, and long-lasting, based on ingredients like myrrh, frankincense, and various tree resins that produce a thick, persistent scent capable of genuinely overpowering less pleasant smells nearby. Modern perfume design frequently aims for subtlety and complexity. Ancient perfume, by contrast, in many documented contexts, appears to have been functioning almost like a defensive tool, an odor powerful enough to meaningfully compete with and often win against the surrounding environment. Archaeology has given us something even more concrete than written references to ancient perfume: actual physical evidence of industrial-scale production. In 2005, archaeologists excavating a site on the island of Cyprus uncovered what's now considered one of the oldest known perfume manufacturing facilities in the world, dating back roughly 4,000 years. The site contained stills, mixing bowls, funnels, and perfume bottles, along with residue that chemists were later able to analyze and identify specific aromatic ingredients from, including extracts of pine, coriander, bergamot, and almond. This wasn't a single household grinding up a few fragrant herbs for personal use. This was organized, large-scale production, with dedicated equipment and a supply chain sophisticated enough to bring together ingredients from multiple different sources, suggesting perfume making had already become a genuine specialized industry, complete with its own tools and techniques, thousands of years before anything resembling modern chemistry existed. Ancient Greece and later Rome inherited and expanded on this same fundamental relationship between fragrance, religion, and status, while adding new layers of their own. Greek athletes famously rubbed scented oils onto their bodies before competing, partly for the pleasant smell, but also because ancient Greek medical thinking held that these oils had genuine therapeutic value for the muscles and skin. Roman baths, despite representing one of the ancient world's most sophisticated public hygiene systems, were still frequently followed by the application of perfumed oils, since even Roman bathing, impressive as it was for its era, didn't achieve anything close to the level of chemical cleanliness modern soap and modern water treatment provide today. Wealthy Romans were known to perfume not just their bodies but their clothing, their furniture, and even, according to some historical accounts, the fountains and public spaces at lavish banquets, using scent as an unmistakable, immersive display of wealth that guests couldn't help but notice the moment they arrived. There's also a genuinely fascinating medical angle here, one that connects perfume directly to some of the earliest medical thinking in human history. Ancient physicians in multiple separate cultures, including in Egypt and later in ancient Greece, operated under early medical theories that connected bad smells directly to disease and good smells to health and healing. This idea, sometimes referred to by historians studying ancient medicine as miasma theory, in its later, more formalized Greek version, held that disease itself could be caused or spread by foul air, and that burning fragrant substances could help purify a space and genuinely protect the people breathing that air from illness. Under this belief system, applying fragrant oils to the body or burning aromatic resins in a room where someone was sick wasn't a comforting gesture layered on top of actual medicine. It was medicine, or at least believed to be a genuinely functional medical intervention based on the best understanding available at the time. Think about how that reframes the entire practice. Ancient people weren't perfuming themselves purely to smell attractive to others. In a meaningful number of documented contexts, they were doing something they sincerely believed was protecting their health based on a real, if scientifically incorrect, theory connecting air quality directly to disease. The instinct wasn't vanity. It was an early, deeply serious attempt at what we would now recognize as public health and medicine, built entirely around the tools and understanding available at the time. There's a compelling case that this instinct runs even deeper than religious belief or early medical theory, reaching back into something closer to raw biology. Human beings, like most mammals, appear to have an evolved aversion to the specific smell profile associated with decay, disease, and rotting organic matter, a reaction plausibly shaped by natural selection, since avoiding these smells in the ancestral environment would have meaningfully reduced exposure to genuinely dangerous pathogens and spoiled food. Researchers studying disgust as a psychological and evolutionary response have found that certain smell categories, specifically those associated with decomposition, trigger a remarkably consistent aversion response across a very wide range of different human cultures, suggesting this reaction isn't purely learned through culture, but has at least some real evolutionary basis behind it. If that's accurate, then covering unpleasant, potentially disease-associated smells with strong, pleasant ones may have originally functioned as a genuinely adaptive behavior, even before anyone had any formal concept of disease, medicine, or religion attached to it at all. You didn't need to understand germs to understand, on a purely instinctive level, that the smell of decay meant something was wrong, and that masking or avoiding that smell felt on a gut level like the safer option. Perfume, under this view, may have started as a cultural elaboration built directly on top of an older, purely instinctive survival response. This evolutionary angle is supported by research into how consistently disgust responses to specific smells show up across completely unrelated human populations. Psychologists studying disgust as a distinct emotional category, rather than simply a matter of personal or cultural taste, have found that reactions to smells associated with bodily waste, spoiled food, and decomposition are remarkably uniform across cultures that have had no meaningful contact with one another, a pattern that's much harder to explain through cultural learning alone than through some shared underlying biological mechanism. If disgust toward these specific smell categories were purely a learned cultural preference, you'd expect far more variation from one society to another than researchers actually find. The consistency itself is evidence, suggesting this reaction sits closer to a hardwired survival instinct than a matter of taste or fashion. Something closer in kind to your reflexive flinch from a hot surface than to your preference for one style of music over another. This connects to something else worth exploring. The specific ingredients ancient cultures reached for weren't chosen randomly. Many of the earliest and most widely used perfume ingredients across separate ancient civilizations, myrrh, frankincense, cedar, and various aromatic tree resins, happen to have genuine antimicrobial properties, meaning they can actually inhibit the growth of certain bacteria and fungi under laboratory conditions modern researchers have since tested. Ancient people had no concept of microbes and no way to test antimicrobial activity directly. But if a particular resin reliably slowed the visible spoilage of stored goods, or seemed associated with fewer people getting sick in spaces where it was regularly burned, that pattern would have been noticed, remembered, and repeated entirely through observation rather than any theoretical understanding of why it worked. Think about what that means. Some ancient perfume ingredients may have been selected gradually over countless generations of trial and observation, partly because they smelled pleasant, and partly because they were, in a very real and measurable sense, doing something genuinely useful, slowing bacterial growth, discouraging insects, or otherwise making an environment marginally safer, even though nobody involved understood the actual mechanism at work. Ancient perfume making, under this view, wasn't purely an aesthetic or religious pursuit. It may have functioned as a form of unintentional, empirically driven folk chemistry, refined slowly through practical experience, social and economic dimension that shouldn't be overlooked, because fragrance in the ancient world often carried enormous symbolic weight tied directly to power, wealth, and status. Many of the most prized perfume ingredients, frankincense and myrrh especially, had to be transported over extraordinarily long trade routes, often across harsh desert terrain, from a limited number of specific growing regions in what is now the Arabian Peninsula and parts of the Horn of Africa. This made high-quality perfume ingredients genuinely rare and expensive, comparable in some historical context to precious metals in terms of trade value. Owning and wearing fine perfume in many ancient societies was a direct, visible display of wealth and status, since the ability to afford imported fragrance signaled real economic power in a way ordinary people simply could not access or replicate. This is part of why perfume became so deeply embedded in religious ritual, political ceremony, and elite social life across so many separate ancient civilizations. It wasn't simply about personal preference. It was frequently a public, visible marker of status, piety, and access to long-distance trade networks, all communicated instantly and directly through a person's scent in a world without many other easy ways to visibly signal wealth or standing at a glance. This is part of why perfume became so deeply embedded in religious ritual, political ceremony, and elite social life across so many separate ancient civilizations. It wasn't simply about personal preference, it was frequently a public, visible marker of status, piety, and access to long-distance trade networks, all communicated instantly and directly through a person's scent in a world without many other easy ways to visibly signal wealth or standing at a glance. The trade network built around this demand was genuinely enormous, and it shaped entire regional economies for centuries. Historians studying what's often called the Incense Route describe a network of overland caravan paths stretching roughly 2,000 kilometers, connecting the frankincense and myrrh-producing regions of southern Arabia to major markets across the Mediterranean and Near East. Entire cities grew wealthy primarily by controlling and taxing this trade, and the journey itself, crossing brutal desert terrain by camel caravan, could take upward of 2 months one way, meaning every unit of perfume ingredient that reached a wealthy household in Rome or Alexandria represented weeks of dangerous, expensive travel before it ever touched a single drop of oil. That difficulty is part of why fragrance carried such enormous status weight. It wasn't simply pleasant. It was proof that someone had access to one of the ancient world's most demanding and expensive supply chains. Perfume also played a strikingly literal role in how several ancient cultures treated death itself, which reinforces just how seriously fragrance was taken as something more than decoration. Ancient Egyptian embalming practices relied heavily on aromatic resins, including myrrh and frankincense, packed directly into the body during mummification, both for their believed spiritual significance and quite practically because these same resins genuinely do have properties that help slow decomposition and mask the odor of a decaying body. This wasn't a minor detail of funerary custom, it was central to it. The same substances people burned in temples to honor the gods and rubbed onto their skin in daily life were also the substances they trusted most to prepare a body for its journey into the afterlife, a continuity that tells you just how completely fragrance was woven into how these societies understood the boundary between life, death, sickness, and the sacred. Now consider how genuinely different this is from the modern relationship between hygiene and fragrance. Today, cleaning your body and applying fragrance are generally understood as two separate sequential steps. You bathe first, using soap specifically engineered to strip away dirt, oil, and odor-causing bacteria, and only afterward, if you choose to, Do you apply a fragrance meant to add something pleasant on top of an already neutral, clean base? That entire sequence depends on a level of understanding about bacteria, hygiene, and body chemistry that simply didn't exist for most of human history. Ancient people had genuinely limited tools for actually removing dirt, oil, and odor-causing substances at a chemical level, so fragrance functioned instead as the primary tool available for managing how a person, or a space, or a ritual object presented itself to the world, in every sense that mattered to them: religious, medical, and social all at once. Soap itself, once it does begin appearing clearly in the historical record, developed slowly and for reasons that weren't originally focused on personal bathing at all. The next major leap in perfume technology came centuries later, during the Islamic Golden Age, and it's worth pausing on because it directly connects ancient practice to the perfume you might actually own today. The physician and polymath Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, is widely credited with significantly advancing the technique of steam distillation for extracting essential oils from flowers, most famously rose petals, allowing for the production of much purer, more concentrated, and longer-lasting fragrances than the older methods of simply steeping plant material in oil or fat. This wasn't a minor technical footnote. Distillation represented a genuine leap in precision and control, moving perfume making away from something closer to intuitive craft and towards something with real repeatable chemistry behind it, even though the underlying science of why it worked wouldn't be fully understood for centuries afterward. Rosewater produced through this refined distillation process became one of the most widely traded luxury goods across the medieval Islamic world, and through trade routes into medieval Europe, carrying the same ancient association with purity, status, and the divine that fragrance had carried for thousands of years already, now delivered through a genuinely more sophisticated technology. It's worth noting that this same distillation breakthrough eventually became foundational to the alcohol-based perfumes that dominate the fragrance industry today. Once distillation techniques advanced further and became capable of producing much higher concentrations of alcohol, perfumers gained access to a solvent that could carry and project scent far more effectively and for much longer than oil-based mixtures ever could. The famous Hungary water, created in the 14th century and often cited as one of the earliest alcohol-based perfumes in European history, represents a direct technological descendant of innovations that trace back through the Islamic Golden Age all the way to the resin-burning and oil-based traditions of ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt thousands of years earlier. The specific tools changed dramatically across that span of time. The underlying human impulse driving the whole project, using scent deliberately and purposefully, barely changed at all. Some of the earliest documented soap-like substances made from combining fats or oils with alkaline ash or similar materials appear to have been used initially for practical purposes like cleaning textiles or preparing wool, rather than for washing the human body as a matter of routine personal care. Archaeological evidence from ancient Babylon, dating back roughly 4,500 years, includes clay cylinders with soap-like formulas inscribed on them, but historians studying these records believe the primary use was almost certainly textile production rather than personal hygiene. A similar pattern shows up in ancient Rome, where a substance resembling soap was known and used, but bathing culture there centered far more heavily on water, oil, and a specialized scraping tool called a strigil, used to physically scrape sweat, oil, and dirt off the skin, rather than on anything resembling a modern lathering soap bar. The idea of regular, dedicated personal bathing with soap as an everyday hygiene practice, the way most people today take for granted, developed gradually over an extremely long stretch of time, and in many regions and eras, it simply wasn't a standard, widely accessible part of daily life at all, even among people who otherwise cared a great deal about how they smelled and presented themselves to others. It's genuinely striking how long this gap persisted. Soap-making techniques did exist and slowly improve across the centuries following those early Babylonian and Roman examples, but soap as a cheap, mass-produced, universally available household item, something every person could simply buy and use daily without a second thought, is a remarkably recent development in the full span of human history, really only becoming genuinely widespread with industrial manufacturing techniques developed within roughly the last 2 centuries. Compare that to the 4,000-plus year head start fragrance already had, and the imbalance becomes almost absurd. For the overwhelming majority of the time humans have been intentionally managing how they present themselves through scent, the specific chemical tools for actually removing dirt and odor-causing bacteria at the source simply weren't available to most people at all. This means that for an enormous span of human history, spanning multiple entire civilizations and thousands of years, managing how you smelled and managing how physically clean you were, in the specific chemical sense we understand today, were 2 almost entirely separate concerns, addressed through completely different tools, technologies, and belief systems, developed independently and for very different underlying reasons. So when you put all of these threads together, the religious significance tied to fragrance as a literal connection to the divine, the early medical theories directly linking smell to disease and health, a plausible underlying evolutionary aversion to the smell of decay, and its associated dangers, the very real antimicrobial properties present in many traditional perfume ingredients, and the powerful social and economic status signaling built into owning and wearing rare imported fragrance, you start to see why perfume developed so early and so independently across so many separate ancient cultures, well before anything resembling modern soap and modern hygiene practices existed at all. It wasn't vanity arriving ahead of its time. It was a genuinely serious, multi-purpose technology, addressing religious, medical, social, and quite possibly even microbiological concerns simultaneously, using the best tools, materials, and understanding available to people living in a world that smelled by any modern standard dramatically different from the one you live in now. It's worth sitting for a moment with just how many separate threads all converge on this single, seemingly simple human habit. A priest in ancient Egypt burning resin to honor a god, a physician in ancient Greece prescribing fragrant oil as genuine medicine, a caravan driver crossing 2 months of open desert to deliver frankincense to a wealthy household in Rome, an embalmer packing myrrh into a body being prepared for the afterlife, a physician in the medieval Islamic world refining distillation techniques that would eventually make their way, centuries later, into a small glass bottle sitting on a bathroom shelf today. None of these people set out to build the multi-billion-dollar global fragrance industry that exists now. Each of them was simply solving an immediate, pressing problem using the tools available in their specific moment in history, and each solution built directly on top of the one before it, across a chain stretching back further than most of the technologies you'd normally think of as ancient. So the next time you spray on a modern fragrance, purely for pleasure as a small finishing touch after a shower using specifically engineered soap and modern plumbing, you're actually engaging in something considerably older and considerably more layered than a simple aesthetic choice. You're participating in one of the oldest continuously practiced human technologies on record, one that ancient people once relied on for reasons that had almost nothing to do with vanity and almost everything to do with religion, medicine, status, and quite possibly, deep down, a very old and very human instinct to protect themselves from a genuinely dangerous, foul-smelling world using the very best tools they had.